Hey, everybody. We're back with Echo today to talk about Chiron and Aries. That is where Chiron is transiting right now. It'll be there for a little while. I'll just let you kind of talk about yeah, I know, because I know that we've talked about this before, and you've definitely brought up some very interesting things about it just in general. Yeah, take it away.
Sure. Yeah, no, totally. It is one of the two longest transits that Chiron goes through, the other being Pisces, that we were talking about in our last video. So to kind of begin understanding the complexities of this particular transit, really diving into what Aries can signify and how it's kind of manifesting through this transit is usually where I like to start out. So specifically, medical astrology from like the medieval times wasn't as scientifically advanced as we are today. So they kind of just chopped up the body horizontally,
Yeah.
Which is actually pretty fine once you get like, up to the hips-ish area. And then it gets a little dicey because like, why is Aquarius the shins? I don't know. They didn't know what like the, neurological systems were back then. So that kind of is a little bit more out the window. But Aries really being the head, anything like from the upper jaw to the top of your head, and everything that includes, like specifically the physiological aspect of astrology here, I think we can gain a lot from. It's not just your, your mouth, the top of your mouth, of course, but also your nose, your eyes, how you perceive the world, right? Like your individual perception, is your reality, your unique identity, your physical brain and how that's affected, and your metaphorical mind is included in that for sure. So, and not even really just those specific pieces, but like your hair and your skin and your bone structure, your facial features, your eye color, all of those things really start to inform Aries as we are tiny little babies just being born, of who is our family, who is a part of our group, who's going to keep us safe versus the people who maybe don't look like us so much and who are not a part of our identity or a part of our group. So those themes really carry over when we talk about like the chironic element of this transit. And it goes really intensely, very quickly into, the themes of racism that we've seen and the effects that that has had. The even breaking down to like the conversations about hair texture and the fact that certain types of hair products are under lock and key in like drugstores and why that is, and the history between that sense of identity and all of the things that specifically in America we have sort of reinforced and had to deal with in all kinds of iterations. So when we think about especially what happened in 2020, because Chiron entered Aries in 2019, by the way, for those who want more of the astrological data aspect of it, and it'll be there until about 2027. It's going to retrograde in and out for a hot minute, but 2027, it's gone for good. So we have a hot minute with this specific set of issues that we're really coming to terms with and facing. Pun intended. But even if you could take into consideration, we were talking in the last video really about how Pluto and Saturn are informing Chiron specifically. And then if you throw Mars into that as well, 2020 was rife with that Mars transit through Aries and then linking up with Chiron and, passing it, retrograding over and passing it again. The skies were bright red with the fires that were happening.
Yeah.
And we were really kind of faced with a lot of those environmental issues that we've been avoiding for quite some time.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the the pandemic that we have all been experiencing since the beginning of 2020, where there was a literal barrier that we had to put, a very Saturnian barrier, with Saturn being in Aquarius, that like air filtration system that covered right up to where Aries starts to, be ruling. So our focus was very much like what we're seeing, what we're ingesting, and whether or not that was a part of our identity, or whether, some people were very against that being a part of their identity, and all the things that go along with it. And really, I think the nail on the head here, again, pun intended, is I can't help myself. Wordplay. It's just a thing. Really the biggest like thing that I've taken away from this specific transit in regards to like your physiology is when you think about the biggest side effect of having COVID-19 for a lot of people was nausea, no longer having the sense of smell, and how much we take that for granted, and how much that informs like our reality, and the real like trippiness that people went through of no longer having access to that.
Even the brain fog.
Yeah.
And I know Mercury is the mind, but the head is Aries. So even the brain fog thing kind of, but yeah.
Well, the neurological issues of long COVID are not to be overlooked. I don't want to like get into too much of like the medical aspect of it and like the doom and gloom, because fear is like tied very specifically to this as well. But like long COVID is not something to play around with or to really turn away from, which is, I think, moving forward in the next 100 or so years, we're going to see that iteration kind of break down. Not just from long COVID, but from other like mental health issues that we've been both starting to face, but also ignore, not just from the standpoint of like being needing therapy and like having trauma and stuff, but like the actual changes physiologically to our brain that is happening with like technology, but also with things like COVID.
You bring, my son, he'll be 5 this year. And he was how old did he turn at that time? He had just turned 2. So he was like 2.5 when COVID started. Right.
Oh.
And it was weird to me to think about how his first memories, right, that he has of him being like 3. I think I say that because I think my first memories were from when I was like 3 or 4 that I really remember. Mm-hmm. They're going to be of half of some, you know what I mean? Like half of somebody. And that is so starkly different than like what your first memories were or what mine. And I'm, this isn't like being for or against the mask. I understand, but it is just so weird. Like the difference in the, mm-hmm. It's very, it's, I do. And, kids, they pick up on how to speak by watching people speak. And there's a whole generation like my son's age that didn't get that in the same way that, so I do wonder, there is a part of me that wonders what the ramifications for that will be down the line, even though I understand why, I get the necessity of why things were the way they were, but I do wonder about the.
Oh yeah. It's not like it's a forced adaptation and evolution. It's not going to be like, oh, we're all fucked because we had to start wearing these masks. Yeah. But if you think about, I always like to, I don't know if you can hear that, it's an ambulance. Okay. I always like to stop and give pause when like sounds like that happen, just in case, because it's not pleasant to listen to as a recipient on a recording. So feel free to edit that out if you want. But what I tend to go back to is the last time Saturn was in Aries, and that was in 1996. And those kids specifically are really going to be, in my personal opinion, that is going to usher in a ton of mental health changes in how we interact with one another and how we really form our identities. Because Windows 95 was really the first like home computer system. And children went from like having that like one-on-one time with actual human faces to being put in front of screens, which is neither good nor bad. Right? It's just different and new, and people will grow and adapt. And so that really kind of ushered in a whole new level of unforeseen effects that are kind of, now those kids are growing up and they're in their early 20s, and a lot of them are going, hey, I have ADHD, hey, I have autism, I have all of these other things that I don't really understand how to interact with, because Saturn being an Aries, just like Chiron being an Aries right now, those kids are really going through it, because Chiron is just there like totally fucking up their Saturn.
Yes.
So they're really getting a handle on how their sense of identity, how we communicate with one another, and really just like facial recognition and facial cues is a huge, huge theme. Pretty much ever since 1996, like we're all sort of figuring our own little place out in that evolution, but people who were born with that have that like next layer of blending. So those kids who were born, during COVID or right before COVID, those first memories, that's going to be really, really impactful for them. Added on to the fact that most of their interactions aren't even going to be like in person, but with a mask covering. It's going to be like this over Zoom, or like in virtual reality. And sort of talking about the internet is a really big theme for me when I talk about Chiron and Aries too, because like this assimilation and like self-uploading of our individual minds into the universal internet is like a really big thing for Chiron and Aries, like the good, bad, and the ugly, right? You go on the internet and like you see everything.
Everything. Yes.
You didn't really necessarily need to see all of that stuff, but you can, and it's there. Exactly. And so it's like we're in this like second rebirth of like the Wild West of the internet almost, where like everything is recorded and people can now manipulate their image, right? Like that face. The Instagram face is now like an amalgamation.
Some of those make the person look like they're a whole other species.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what the fuck that's about? Those filters, like I'll put them on my face and I'm like, okay, I give one to wanting something that has makeup, whatever, but this don't even look like me. I'm like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah. Well, and like the really spooky thing is like the deep fakes and like the software that like takes, any number of photos of someone's face and like animates it into a situation that they never were in. And of course, that happens in humans, it's always going to porn first. It's just what our weird little bodies do. But like the manipulation of imagery and like digital fabrication is starting with those filters, and we're seeing like people kind of cosplaying as other people and like using their face in these ways. And what's going to end up happening, especially when Chiron enters like Taurus and Gemini, it's going to add the voice feature of that too. So at some point, you're going to be able to completely make a fake piece of history of digital like artifacts. People can already do this, but like every person will be able to just fabricate a reality. Like I can just make Obama do the chicken dance or whatever, like from my computer on my break, on my lunch break or whatever. So like what is real versus what's not real? Who are we as individuals and as a society, and like how that interplays with what we see, right? Like so many people in 2020 just completely saw different things when they watched the news or like,
Yes. And I think, honestly, some of that I feel like has to do with the fact that people were so isolated that it's like they kind of, not everybody, of course, but some people fell down a rabbit hole one way or the other. You know what I mean? I don't know about everybody else. I would actually force myself to watch differing channels just so that I could, you know what I mean? Just so I could see different.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Like even if I felt like one of the channels was total bullshit, I still watched it because I wanted that the differing whatever, but yeah, there was a very stark difference in reality. And that seems, that's, really though, that even started at least a little bit during like, earlier in the Trump era.
Oh yeah, that was Chiron and Pisces. That was everything is nothing and nothing is everything. Yeah, that's one of the big reasons why these two transits between Pisces and Aries are like the longest, because you really need to like take that Piscean, everything is disorienting and confusing and there is no real container for any of this shit, like what's going on, pushing people's boundaries. Issues of consent really were a big thing. Issues of gender identity really started bubbling up in the Chiron and Pisces era in like a real concrete way, with like legislation and just general conversations that were happening. And then as we're moving into Aries, it's not as much the physical gender, it is the gender identity. And it's just that word again of like identity. Who am I? Like, what do I feel like? And why is the physical part of my body not really matching up with who I know to be myself, like in my mind? Mm-hmm. So really Chiron and Aries is like that bridging the gap between the mind, the uncontained mind, and your actual physical brain, and the effects that changing one will have on changing the other, and not being allowed to access one will affect the other. And like there's a ton of issues that lots of different topics that we could really talk about when it gets to that kind of stuff. But yeah,
for sure. And then like the retrograde period between, before it was firmly in Aries and in Pisces, that felt kind of all over the place, probably because it kept bouncing around with what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really bleary-eyed kind of feeling of like just waking up and being like super disoriented and not really understanding. But then, when we really are solidly with Aries right now, this transit, we get into the exhausting nature of having your face on the internet, or even like your words attached to a profile picture. Anything that people want to express is kind of being passed through all the different kinds of filters of like extreme backlash. Because again, Aries is still like, screaming, that like really frustrated screaming aspect of it. So you have like people who are kind of almost paralyzed by the fact that like, oh, if my face and my voice are attached to the things that I may actually really believe, but if it's just exploded on the internet for whatever reason and there's backlash to it, then all of a sudden my entire identity is something completely different and I have no say in it. Like once you put your face out into the ether, you don't have control over it anymore. And that is incredibly exhausting. Like the mental taxing element of having to self-censor and like assimilate into what you assume is something that will not be taken poorly by the mass internet, is really something that I think everyone is contending with. And then of course you get like the offshoot of like cancel culture and the backlash to cancel culture, and like that dichotomy is coming out. Like, are we,
Yes. The not having control over that once you put yourself out there. I like to do a lot of disclaimers. I'm not sure that really helps, but
yeah, well, it's exhausting. That is, and I do that too.
That is it. Yes, it is exhausting, but almost seems necessary so things aren't taken out of context, or things aren't, well, hopefully people could still probably find ways to twist things if they wanted to, but
but it is necessary to start recalibrating and understanding how many different ways people can view the same exact image, right? Like so it's not like old grumpy kind of like, boomer attitude of like, everyone's so sensitive these days. But it's like, it does take a huge mental toll on everybody when they're genuinely afraid that like if they say something, it's going to be used against them, or like it's a psychotic kind of state that we have to navigate. And like the swell of that intensity will peter out eventually as we sort of learn to work with it, and the disclaimers will go away and we'll start getting more comfortable with it. But again, it's like attaching your personhood and your sense of self to what other people view you as, and like what happens to your face and like your identity in the point of view of someone else. You know, people who get canceled still continue living their life. Roman Polanski is still fucking making movies. Like, yeah. There are people who do like actually terrible things, and they're still entire human beings that are living among us just like everybody else. So it's this real difficulty of constantly looking in the mirror with social media and with the internet. And even if you never post and if you never even show your face online, you're still looking at every single human iteration of a person and personhood that you are consuming and judging, and like watching other people consume and judge. And like your identity is being formed by all of these weird little fractal iterations of what is okay and what's not, based on millions of other points of view. So really nobody goes unaffected from this massive shift.
It makes it in somehow, regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about Chiron in Aries, specifically in terms of the US's Chiron return?
Sure. Yeah, I know that you had a video that you started touching on that a little bit. And for my personal research and how I've been sort of reading this, and I have my Don't Forget About Flint t-shirt on right now. The ramifications, specifically when it comes to race and forced assimilation, is a big theme as a country that the United States has had to contend with every 50 years during this Chiron return. We're always dealing with it, and people who are being oppressed by all sorts of different systems that we have in place are obviously dealing with it every single day. But even going back to like the 1800s, especially the 1820s and the 1870s, the 200 years ago, ish, of the Chiron returns in the 1800s, that was when colonization was in like full swing. Like it was rampant all around the globe, and the United States was sort of taking part in it, but also just on this specific continent, on this land, the forced assimilation of indigenous people was really being implemented into law. And we saw like the residential schools be absolutely everywhere, forcing indigenous tribes to become more white and like become more European. And I really strongly recommend, if anybody is watching these videos and is unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, to go and do some research about the residential schooling systems that we forced indigenous nations to go through, because we're still seeing the impacts of those today. And that's really the point. Again, because of your identity, your facial structure, literally having blue eyes or not, it was being punished, and the forced assimilation throughout the years was being legislated. I think we saw in the 1970s, 1975, which was during one of the most recent Chiron returns in Aries for the United States, we had the Indian Children Welfare Act, which was kind of counteracting the fact that more indigenous children, for whatever reason, were being taken from their families at much, much higher rates than any other race. And that act was really put in place as one of many pieces of legislation to sort of give the indigenous people a lot more autonomy within their own culture, within their own tribes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in 1978 was the Indian Children Welfare Act. But in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act came into place, which was basically saying you don't have to put your children into these residential schools. You can school them however you want. You can keep your education systems the way you prefer, which was a really big deal in my personal opinion, because that was the beginning of sort of, but not really, taking accountability for the incredible atrocities that had been forced upon them for over 100 years at that point. And then, of course, in 2021, we saw that that particular act, the Indian Children Welfare Act, was coming under review, I think, by the Supreme Court. I might be mistaken about the actual level it got to, but it was basically because there were a few cases of white or non-Indigenous folks wanting to adopt Native children, especially in the wake of the fact that COVID affected those communities so much more than any other demographic, and every terrible thing that people go through really affects the Indigenous populations of our country much more than any other demographic. But so they were fighting to really keep this, we want to make sure that Indigenous children are adopted with priority to other Indigenous folks, as opposed to just letting like any random person of any random ethnicity just kind of scoop them up. And that was really, like, you can see the natural trajectory of 1820s when this really like took hold, and then in the 1970s when we started to sort of make amends but not really, and then in this Chiron return, we're really seeing like the true ramifications, because some of the, not just the reasons why some of these children need to be adopted is because of like things like COVID-19, but also just the difficult nature of the coping mechanisms that have been put in place for a lot of those demographics. I think the rates of diabetes and alcoholism is just like so much higher in Indigenous communities than in any other demographic. And if you understand what any of them have had to go through just living on the land that like they truly do belong on, and trying to assimilate or being forced to assimilate into a colonized structure, like that is absolutely and completely understandable. And we're seeing, especially in 2020 and 2021, like the discovery and I don't even want to call it rectification, but seeing the graves of the children from the residential schools being discovered, or at least talked about for the first time, that natural progression is really incredibly indicative, just historically, of what this country has of many things to face and to heal. And again, it's just that issue of like our identity and who is safe and who is not safe to be taken care of, and who to trust, and all of these themes. And that's going to continue on pretty much in perpetuity. But we have a real chance here in the next few years to, as individuals, kind of rectify our own piece of that puzzle. You know what I mean?
Yes. Like if we individually come correct, right, mm-hmm. then maybe we can universally come correct, kind of thing, kind of hope, or that's the hope.
Yeah. Well, and it's really up to those of us who haven't been oppressed, right? Like I have white skin, you have very light skin. We are naturally in rooms where people assume that we agree with them, and we hear things that will have very real consequences on people who are not in that room. And if we don't take the opportunity to say something and say that's not okay, like absolutely not, we are not going to tolerate that, the effects of that silence is astronomical. So it's not just affecting those who are oppressed by race, by gender, anything like that. It's also really a call to action for those of us who have parts of our identity that are in the American ideal, right? So, which isn't, nobody actually has any of these qualities like from birth, but being a straight white guy is way easier than really being anything else. But yeah, being in those rooms and taking advantage of the pieces that you have been given, and not identifying with the power that gives you, because we've seen very easily how people choose the power cards that they've been given, as opposed to no longer identifying with everything that comes with that in favor of equanimity, right? So that's another piece of that Chiron and Aries, like that self-abandonment is not really like, I am not a white person, I am a person, and I no longer wish to give whiteness power, so I am going to actively abandon that. And it's something that you have to continually do in perpetuity.
Yeah, it is. It most definitely.
Yeah. And the inherent mutability is something that we see.
Yeah.
Which is why this is taking so long.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to say about Chiron and Aries and the US's Chiron return before we head off?
I mean, probably, I can talk about anything for hours and hours and hours. I mean, is there anything that you came upon, I guess, in your research that you found particularly interesting or odd?
Well, that was I did go into some things. I was still kind of fleshing that particular one out, because it seemed like it could go some different ways. Definitely with Chiron being in the US's fourth house, it definitely makes sense for the land, right? Like, and actually the assimilation of the land, on the land, things like that. It definitely makes sense that this would definitely be a part of it. It certainly makes sense to me. I'm still fleshing that stuff out though. So
yeah,
but
no, it's for sure. And that's going to be, again, it's the physical land is going to be when that transit into Taurus is going to happen. We're going to see a lot more of that as well, with the food and all of that. So
I think
it's not just Aries.
Yeah, no, I was talking specifically about the fourth house, the home, the homeland. But
yeah,
I think we're even gonna see some food stuff with Pluto's return, like food, land shit going on there too. Just perhaps in a different way, a slightly different way, but
yeah. Well, they're all interacting with one another too. So that's like really very, very important to keep in mind. But on like a universal level, I think, or on a country level, I think the fourth house is really like the house of like not just like the land, but the actual like governance, if I'm not mistaken. So having, usually when we see those points, you mentioned in your last video about this, about how the 70s were really embarrassing.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, the 70s were super embarrassing for a lot of us, because the government was making moves that were obviously not in the best interest, or really that the people they represent wanted them to do.
Yeah.
And so government corruption is always really a big thing that happens around these time periods too. The Industrial Revolution is something that happened, I think, in the 1870s, if I'm not mistaken. But like every iteration of a Chiron return in Aries for the United States has had some sort of like technology bump, right? Like computers specifically were invented at the end of the 60s and started to be things in the 70s. And now we're seeing like the second generation, the iteration of that. So it's the explosive energy that Aries brings is not just like the war and the violence, but it's also this like birth that is full of momentum.
Totally.
And the way that we can really get tripped up kind of like as a culture and a society with this is if we're so excited to move forward and not really understand what we're leaving in our wake, because it's something that we still have to contend with. It's going to follow us, right? We can't just like leave it.
and then we'll have to deal with it later.
Yeah, and it's going to be worse. It's going to be so much worse.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So yeah, it's a constant pull from both the past and the future to split our time and energy. So it's a lot. It's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, I think it will be, but it's ultimately good. It's ultimately it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll go ahead and head off here. But do you want to share where people can find you?
Oh, yeah, totally. So my website is fruitionvisions.com. I do astrology consultations. I do one-on-one astro chats and teaching. I also do esoteric herbalism and reality adjustments. You can find all that fun stuff on my website. You can find me at Fancy Monster Vision on Instagram and Spiraling Echoes on Twitter.
Very cool. And I will also put this in the description box so that people can find you.
Yeah, totally.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed listening.
Yeah.
I enjoyed listening to you. I did it. Yeah. I did.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was always fun to meet and connect with people who really understand astrology in modern terms the way that you do. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will see all of y'all later.